So hello everyone, and I hope everyone is well. So I want to make some videos here for Chapter 17, and basically Chapter 17 discusses how the Fed and how the magic of how money is created, how the money supply is created, and how the Fed makes money. So the three main characters in this play, so to speak, of money creation is the central bank, which of course is our Federal Reserve System, right? Regular banks, depository institutions, and financial intermediaries, and us, individuals and institutions who borrow and who lend money and put it in savings accounts. Okay. So here's the Fed. Even the Fed has a balance sheet. The Federal Reserve has a balance sheet. So here's the assets, securities, and loans to financial institutions. So loans are assets, right? Because money is owed to the Fed, right? And here's the liabilities. And believe it or not, the currency and reserves are liabilities for the Fed because it's payable. Money, greenbacks, as we know, or money, is payable by the Fed, and they're responsible for having it in circulation. Okay, and so that's their liability. And any reserves that are collected, they're liable for, right? They have to basically return. So again, currency in circulation in the hands of the public, reserves, bank deposits at the Fed, and the Fed and the banks of vault cash. All right. So assets are government securities holdings by the Fed that affect the money supply and earn interest. When the Fed wants to change the money supply, they buy and sell treasuries, right? Government securities. And they'll either create money or remove money from the money supply, right? And of course, discount loans provide money reserves to the banks and earn the discount rate. Banks don't normally like to borrow money from the Fed because it raises a flag about their ability to survive. So banks will normally lend and borrow from each other in the Fed funds market. And the Fed funds rate is the rate at which banks will borrow and lend, from each other. And that's the rate that the Federal Reserve toys with all the time. All right, so here's the control. Here's the monetary base, MB here. And the monetary base is made up of currency in circulations, donated as C, and total reserves in the banking system, right? And I don't know, they give this the title of high-powered money, right? And here's how basically the open market purchase from a bank works. And here's the banking system. They have assets, right? They'll have securities, and they'll have reserves. So here's the way the assets work. And here's the Federal Reserve System with their assets of 100 million in securities and liabilities and 100 million in reserves. So you look here, basically you'll notice that reserves have increased by 100 million here, right? And there's really no change in the currency, right? And securities here. But the reserves have gone up by 100 million, right? So the monetary base has basically risen by $100 million because basically the reserves were put from the banking system into the Fed's into the reserve account at the Fed. So you see the monetary base has risen by 100 million. All right, so here's another look at that, and here's from Nonbank Public. And basically, a person selling bonds to the Fed deposits the Fed's check in the bank. Right? They sold a bond and they got to get paid. And it's an identical result as if they purchased it from the bank. So you can see that this is the banking system. So you can see the checkable deposit was made here for $100 million, and this is added to the reserves, and here's the Federal Reserve. So depending on whether they basically bought it from the Fed, the outcome is the same from a balance sheet standpoint or through the banking system. Okay, so you can see the end result is the same. And here again, here it is. Here's the non-bank public. So here's the securities, and here's the currency. Okay. So the person selling the bond will now cash the Fed's check, right? So reserves are unchanged, right? So you can see that, and the currency in circulation increases over here by 100 million of the open market purchase. And the monetary base will basically increase by the amount of the open market purchase. So you can kind of see that here. The monetary base is increasing. So you can see the currency in circulation has increased by 100 million at that point. So the effect of the open market purchase on reserves pretty much depends on whether the seller of the bonds keeps the proceeds from the sale of in currency or in deposits. So the effect of this open market purchase on the monetary base always increases the monetary base by the amount of the purchase. Okay, so there's more money now circulating. Circulating in the economy. All right, so here's an open market sale again. Here's an open market sale. Here's the security. Here's the currency, right? It was being sold. And here's the Federal Reserve System, their balance sheet. And the sale, an open market sale by the reduces the monetary base by the amount of the sale. Reserves again are going to remain unchanged here, right? Reserves remain unchanged. So the effect of open market operations on the monetary base is much more certain than, of course, the effect on the reserves. Okay. So you can see here the mechanism where people making deposits turn money into currency. So here's a deposit, right, into a bank, which now becomes currency, okay? And basically, so this is the non-bank public, right? And here's the banking system, which now has to keep money in reserves, right? So they have to do that. And here's their checkable deposits, right? Which is a liability, but you can clearly see here the currency in circulation and the reserve. So what I want to do is include basically another short video here that shows some of these ideas. I mean, I think it's a really good video. How money's being shifted and money's being created.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Now we're going to be talking about Chapter 14, and this is the money supply creation process. And this is about as close to magic as economics gets. We'll see that under certain circumstances, money can be created almost out of thin air. Not quite. I'm only exaggerating a little bit here, but I'm not too far off the mark. And so what we want to do here is think, well, gee, how does the money supply, how does money get created in a financial system? And what we want to see here is that there are four actors in this game or in this play. We have the central bank. So for the United States, of course, that's the Fed. We have banks, depositors, and we have borrowers. And we want to see how all these four actors work together. Now, in this first part here, we will focus on banks, depositors, and borrowers. And later on, we'll bring in and explicitly focus on the central bank and see how it affects the money supply creation process. So again, we're going to be focusing on the latter three: banks, depositors, and borrowers here to begin with. So, basic background. without going into very much detail, what we want to get across here is to think about how the banking system operates. A standard bank accepts deposits from folks like us. They then take those deposits, aggregate them together, and then lend them out to other consumers. They lend them out to businesses, and sometimes they lend them out to governments. So you think that's, gosh, exactly what banks do. Banks collect deposits and they make loans. And that process of collecting deposits and making loans is very important for our money supply creation process, as we will see. And so our types of institutions, we have commercial banks, which are by far the largest. We have savings and loan associations, they're somewhat smaller. And then we have credit unions, which are much smaller still on average. If you look at a depository institution and what their balance sheet looks like, and again, this will be important to us, the loan component is by far the largest, and again, that's not surprising. That's why we invented banks and other similar institutions, is to, among other things, make loans. They also hold U.S. government securities, so they lend money to the government. They hold other securities. They hold corporate bonds, for example. They also hold vault cash, so this is when you and I go to the bank and we want to make a withdrawal. The bank can actually come up with the cash to do that. And they also hold what are called reserves with the central bank. In this case, of course, this is the Fed. And these reserves are on deposit with the Fed. And the crucial thing to keep in mind here, and this is going to be important for us, not in this video, but later on, that the Fed acts as a bank for banks. So whatever relationship you have with a standard bank, a bank has that relationship with the Fed. And again, that will be important later on. On the liability side, banks have savings and time deposits. Time deposits, of course, for example, would be something like certificates of deposits. To you and I, who own a savings account or a CD, they're assets, but to a bank, they become, of course, liabilities. Banks borrow money, so they issue their bonds. And this is going to be very important for us. Checking accounts. To you and I, your checking account balance represents an asset. To banks, that represents a liability. And banks, of course, have to be owned by somebody somewhere, so they have owner's equity. We also have to look here just briefly at the balance sheet of the Fed. Their assets, their major assets right now are government securities and mortgage-backed securities. They also make loans to banks and other institutions. Their liabilities, they hold reserve deposit from banks. And to them, the money you have in your pocket or the coin you have in your wallet or your purse, that represents to the Fed a liability. Now, on to money creation here. So in terms of how money gets created, it gets done very simply by how banks do what they do every day, by making loans. And we have, and most countries have this too, is what's called a fractional reserve system. So when you make a deposit, what happens is this. The bank is required by law to keep a certain fraction of that deposit on reserve. What they can do is, of course, loan out the rest of that. So the easiest way to see this is to run through a specific numeric example to see how everything works. So let's suppose you get, it's your lucky day. You're walking along and you happen to find $1,000 in cash that somebody else hasn't picked up. So being your lucky day, what do? You go down to your local bank and you make a deposit. Either you have a checking account or you open one up. So you deposit the $1,000 in cash into the bank. And so what we want to do here is see what the bank's balance sheet looks like. Well, when you make a deposit, of course, for you, that's going to be an asset. But to the bank, that's a liability because the bank owes you that $1,000. Because if you want to go, write a check against it or take it out altogether, make a withdrawal, the bank has to pay that to you. What happens to the bank's asset side when you make this deposit? Well, right away, what happens is that since it's a checking deposit, and in the United States right now, banks are required to hold 10% of checking deposit accounts on reserve, the bank has what's called $100 in required reserves. Reserves they have to hold against that $1,000 deposit. But what also happens is, at least initially, they have $900 in excess reserves, reserves that they do not have to hold against that $1,000 deposit. Now, in general, under ordinary circumstances, what would a bank do with that $900 of excess reserves? Well, they'll do what banks were invented to do. They would make a loan. And so let's suppose they make a loan to somebody named Mike. Well, how does their balance sheet change? Well, nothing on the right side changes because they still owe you that $1,000. However, the left side, the asset side, changes. They still have the $100 in required reserves, and they have that because they still have your $1,000 deposit. But now also notice that they have made a $900 loan to somebody else, right? And so the idea here is that the bank's balance sheet has changed so that on the left side now they have the $100 required reserve and the $900 loan. So here's what we want to do, is we want to investigate where does that $900 loan go. So remember, so we've started with one bank and one deposit and one loan. Well, that's only the beginning of the process. We want to carry on. What happens to that $900 loan? Well, suppose that Mike takes his $900 loan and deposits it in a different bank. Now, we don't need that to happen. We don't need to be deposited in a different bank. We could keep all this same action within the confines of Bank A. But it makes it a little more convenient if we think of this of the flow of money here, follow the money, so to speak, to go from bank to bank to bank. So now, Bank B gets this deposit. So Bank B gets a deposit, just like before, except now instead of $1,000 that you found, it's now $900. Well, it's now a $900 deposit. Based on that $900 and the 10% reserve requirement, this bank, Bank B, has to hold $90 in reserves, and they now have $810 of excess reserves. So just like before, just like with Bank A, Bank B can now make a loan, except now Bank B is limited to they can't loan out $900, they can only loan out $810. So that's exactly what they do, is they make an $810 loan. Again, the right side of the balance sheet, and this is important, does not change. And what we want to emphasize here is this: that $900 deposit for Mike and your initial $1,000 deposit, those simultaneously exist. And that's going to be important for us here in just a couple of minutes. So now we get to Bank C. Bank C gets the $810 deposit. They now have $81 in required reserves, $729 in excess reserves. They can then turn around, of course, and then make a $729 loan. And so notice this process simply repeats itself, but on a smaller scale each and every time. So we could carry on here with Bank D, E, F, and so on and so forth. But it's all the same process from bank to bank to bank. And that's the crucial thing to understand here. Well, the pattern is this: every deposit and loan, for that matter, is 10% less than the preceding one. And so the question is, well, what happens when this process reduces itself finally to zero? By how much have total deposits and total loans in the banking system changed? And the crucial thing to keep in mind is this: is all of those deposits, your first $1,000 deposit, the $900 subsequent deposit, the next $810 deposit, and so on and so forth, all of those exist at the same time. So what we could do is we could do the infinite sum, of course, 1,000, 900, 810, and so on. But that takes a really long time. And so what happens here is, because there's a pattern, this pattern reduces to a very convenient, very simple formula. And so all you need to do to calculate total deposits in the banking system is to take your initial change in the deposits, right here, that's going to be $1,000, and then multiply it by 1 over whatever the required reserve ratio is. In our case, that's the 10% figure we've been using all along. So now we go down to the actual numbers, is you take your $1,000 initial deposit and multiply it by what turns out to be 10, and that's how we get the $10,000. So your initial $1,000 deposit that you miraculously found lying in the street somewhere morphs its way into a total of $10,000 in deposits throughout the entire banking system. So that's based on your $1,000 deposit, and that's based on the 10% reserve requirement. And so what we can do here is set up a summary table. So with Bank A, we had your initial $1,000 deposit. We had the initial $900 loan, and that Bank A has to keep $100 in reserve. Bank B gets a $900 deposit. They can make $810 in loans, and they have to keep $90 in reserves. If we kept going through the entire financial system through banks D, E, F, and so forth, that process eventually reduces to and sums up to the total change in deposits of $10,000 that we just talked about. And that can be broken up in a little bit finer detail that the banking system ended up making in total $9,000 worth of loans, and in total reserves in the banking system, and this is important, required reserves in the banking system total $1,000. So this represents required reserves. So that $1,000 in deposits, $1,000 in reserves supports in total $10,000 in deposit. So it's not an accident that total reserves, $1,000, is 10% of the total volume of deposits. So in effect, what happens is this. Each $1 of your initial deposit supports a total of $10 in overall deposits. And what we saw is that the money supply rises by $9,000. The reason it rises by $9,000 is because your initial $1,000 deposit was already counted as part of the money supply. But once you put it in the banking system, and that process we just talked about begins to take place, total money in the economy, total money supply tends to rise. Now, what happened is this, is you deposited that $1,000 into the banking system. That $1,000 became, as we saw, reserves. Reserves, it turns out, are called, or part of high-powered money. And the reason they're called high-powered money is because they can do a lot of work. They can do a lot of work in this sense. Your $1, each $1 of your deposits supported a $10 change in the total money supply. So in terms of what we've done here, we've calculated what's called the simple deposit expansion multiplier, and that's 1 over the required reserve ratio. So in our simple example, that turned out to be simply 10. We found the total change in deposits is just our deposit expansion multiplier by the overall change in deposits. And here's what we're going to do in another video, is we'll want to see, well, the actual deposit multiplier isn't the same as that value of 10 that we just came up with. And there's several good reasons for that. First, some people hold currency, because our example that we did, I didn't mention it, but it turns out to be important, is that nobody held any currency. All deposits went into a bank, and then when loans were made, those became subsequent deposits. So nobody held any currency, and of course that's not realistic. People do that, so we need to account for that eventually. And in addition, banks also sometimes hold excess reserves, reserves above and beyond that which are required. Our example assumed that banks hold 0 excess reserves. And so what we'll do in a subsequent video is we'll get rid of or relax both of those assumptions to see, well, what happens in terms of if you deposit $1 in a bank, how much does the money supply actually change? And it changes by a much lesser amount than our simple example here. And then what we'll also see in subsequent videos is, well, how does the Fed or any central bank fit into this money supply creation process? And we'll see exactly how that works again in subsequent videos. And we're done.